Hi, everyone, and welcome back to True Crime Echoes. Today, I want to take you into a story that proves appearances can be the most dangerous disguise of all. When you picture a serial killer, you probably think of someone menacing someone who looks the part. But what if I told you one of the most chilling cases in American true crime history was carried out by a woman who looked like your sweet grandmother, the kind of person who baked pies, poured coffee, and offered a warm smile to social workers and neighbors? This is the story of Dorothea Puente, a woman who ran a boarding house in Sacramento during the 1980s. On the outside, she seemed like a caretaker for society's forgotten the homeless, the elderly, the addicted, but behind closed doors, she was orchestrating something far darker. What unfolded at 1426 F Street would shock the country and remind us all that evil doesn't always look the way we expect. Chapter 1. The Ordinary Face of Evil. Hi, friends. I want to take you back to a case that still unsettles me every time I think about it. Imagine walking past a small, ordinary-looking house with lace curtains in the windows and flowers on the porch. You wouldn't suspect for a moment that the woman inside, an older lady with silver hair and a grandmotherly smile, was hiding one of the darkest secrets in American true crime history. This is the story of Dorothea Puente. To the world, she looked like a sweet caretaker, a woman devoted to helping the poor, the elderly, and the sick. She offered hot meals, a warm bed, and what seemed like genuine compassion. But behind that carefully built image, she was quietly becoming one of the most notorious female serial killers the United States had ever seen. Her case fascinates me because it forces us to question appearances. How do we define a monster? We're used to stories of killers who look dangerous, who fit the stereotype, wild-eyed, menacing, maybe already known for violence. But Dorothea was the opposite. She was soft-spoken, neatly dressed, always ready with a plate of pie or a comforting word. People trusted her because she didn't look like evil, and that's what made her so dangerous. Before we dive into her crimes, it's important to understand where she came from. Dorothea didn't grow up with the kind of stability or kindness most of us would hope for. In fact, her childhood reads like a checklist of trauma, abuse, neglect, abandonment. And while that doesn't excuse what she later became, it does paint a chilling picture of how pain can twist someone's path. So let's go back to the very beginning, January 9th, 1929, in San Bernardino, California. That's where her story starts and where the roots of something deeply unsettling began to grow. Chapter 2. A Childhood of Shadows. Dorothea Puente entered the world on January 9th, 1929, in San Bernardino, California. Now, San Bernardino back then wasn't the bustling city you might picture today. It was just beginning to grow still rough around the edges, a place where families came hoping to build something new. But for little Dorothea, there was nothing hopeful about her beginnings. Her family life was chaotic from the start. She came from a large family, some reports say 6 siblings, others claim as many as 17. The truth is fuzzy, partly because Dorothea herself told so many different stories about her childhood that even the most basic facts became unreliable. That was something she would carry into adulthood, the ability to rewrite her own past whenever it suited her. What we do know for certain is that her parents were deeply troubled. Her mother was still very young when she started having children. To make money, she turned to sex work, and at home she was described as abusive and neglectful. Alcohol was her constant companion. The children learned early on that their mother neither wanted them nor enjoyed being around them. Sometimes she would simply disappear for days, leaving the kids locked in a closet for their own safety. Imagine being so young and only knowing love in the form of confinement and abandonment. Her father wasn't any better. He also leaned heavily on alcohol, but his cruelty had a different flavor. He was a broken man, a World War I veteran, whose lungs were permanently damaged after being exposed to mustard gas. Illness weighed on him, but it was his emotional instability that left the deepest scars. He had a habit of staging dramatic suicide threats right in front of his children, pulling out a gun, pressing it to his head, and telling them he was going to end his life. He never pulled the trigger, but for a child, those moments are unforgettable. To grow up with that kind of terror in your living room, day after day, leaves marks that never fade. When Dorothea was just 8 years old, tragedy finally struck in a way that was permanent. Her father died of tuberculosis. Less than a year later, her mother was killed in a motorcycle accident. In a single year, Dorothea went from living in chaos to living with nothing at all. She was an orphan, shuffled from foster home to foster home, never rooted anywhere, never truly safe. It's during this time people say that Dorothea discovered the power of stories. She began lying, inventing new versions of herself to fit into whatever situation she landed in. Maybe it was survival. Maybe it was her way of escaping a reality that was too painful to face. But it planted a seed. If she could manipulate her own history, maybe she could manipulate other people too. Looking back, I can't help but wonder, was this the turning point? So many children endure terrible abuse and neglect, yet they don't become killers. But in Dorothea's case, it feels like her unstable childhood gave her a lifelong script: hide the truth, reinvent yourself, and do whatever it takes to get by. That's a dangerous lesson for a child to learn, and it's one she carried with her into every chapter of her life. And by the time she was a teenager, she was already rewriting her identity, creating the character who would charm, deceive, and eventually destroy so many lives. Chapter 3: Reinventing Herself. By the time Dorothea reached her teenage years, she was already tired of being Dorothea. That name, that identity, carried too much pain, too many memories of closets, drunken threats, and foster homes. So at just 16 years old, she did what she had learned to do best: she reinvented herself. She left behind the pieces of her old life and moved north to Olympia, Washington. There, she introduced herself as Sherry. Not Dorothea, not the broken little girl, but Sherry, a name that sounded lighter, freer, like someone who had never been abandoned or unloved. People believed her because she carried herself with a confidence she had never really earned. It was the first sign of the mask she would wear for the rest of her life. In Olympia, she found small jobs to keep herself afloat. She worked at a milkshake shop, which must have felt almost wholesome on the surface. But to make ends meet, she also turned to sex work, a decision that probably felt natural after watching her mother do the same. For Dorothea or Sherry, it wasn't about shame or morality. It was about survival and maybe even a little bit of control. It was during this time in 1945 that she met a man who would change the trajectory of her life. His name was Fred McFall, a World War II veteran. He saw in her what so many others would see later: a woman who seemed stable, nurturing, maybe even a little mysterious. After only a few months, they got married. Quick marriages weren't unusual back then, especially in the shadow of war, but this one was built on a foundation of lies. Fred thought he was marrying a woman named Sheriel Racile. He thought she was 30 years old. In reality, she was 16. 16, pretending to be twice her age, playing the role of a mature woman when she was barely out of childhood herself. I can't decide if Fred was incredibly naive or if Dorothea was already that skilled at manipulating people. Maybe it was both. Not long after their marriage, Dorothea and Fred moved to Nevada, trying to build a life together. They had 2 daughters, one in 1946 and another in 1947. But motherhood wasn't something Dorothea wanted or maybe even understood. Within a short time, both children were taken from her. One went to live with relatives, the other was placed for adoption. The details are murky, but the fact remains she lost them, and she never seemed to fight to get them back. By 1948, the marriage had fallen apart. Dorothea and Fred divorced, and once again she rewrote the story. Instead of admitting she was a divorced young woman, she told people her husband had died. Being a widow, she thought, carried more dignity than being a failed wife, and people believed her. That pattern: marrying, lying, discarding, and reinventing, was already well established even before she turned 20. She was learning that deception could smooth over the cracks in her life, that lies could erase inconvenient truths. And every time she got away with it, it made her bolder. This was only the beginning. Soon, Dorothea's lies would spill over from her personal life into her public one. She wasn't just hiding from her past anymore. She was beginning to build a future on fraud, theft, and manipulation. Chapter 4: The First Crimes. After her first marriage crumbled, Dorothea, or whatever name she was using at the time, was left adrift. She didn't have money stability or family to lean on. What she did have was a talent for survival, and she wasn't afraid to bend the rules to get by. That's how her next chapter began, not with love or redemption, but with her very first criminal conviction. Back in San Bernardino, Dorothea turned to something she thought was easy: writing bad checks. Maybe she saw it as harmless. Maybe she told herself it wasn't really stealing. But she was caught, and for the first time she felt the cold reality of jail. She spent 4 months behind bars and was placed on 3 years probation. For most people, that kind of punishment would be a wake-up call. For Dorothea, it was more like an inconvenience, something to get around, rather than something to learn from. Within 6 months, she violated her probation by moving to San Francisco. It wasn't just about changing cities, it was about changing her skin. Dorothea remarried quickly, as if collecting husbands was just another way to build new identities. Each marriage gave her a fresh start, a different last name, a new cover story to hide behind. She even began telling people she was of different nationalities or religions depending on what she thought would serve her best. At one point, she claimed to be an Israeli Muslim woman. Reinvention had become second nature. But beneath those disguises, a darker pattern was emerging. In 1960, Dorothea set up what looked like a bookkeeping business. In reality, it was a front for a brothel, and she ran it as the madam. For a while it worked. She made money, played the role, and kept the facade intact. But the landlord grew suspicious and reported her to the police. An undercover sting confirmed everything, and Dorothea found herself in jail again, this time for 90 days. It didn't stop her. If anything, she walked out of jail with more confidence in her ability to slip through cracks. She had learned she could charm her way through scrutiny, survive short sentences, and keep moving forward. Her second husband, who had supported her during the brothel fiasco, left her as soon as she got out of jail. Another divorce, another reinvention. And soon, Dorothea's attention shifted toward something new, something that seemed almost respectable. She opened an unlicensed care home. She called it the Samaritans. It was supposed to be a place for the elderly, for the sick, for people struggling with addiction or mental illness. In reality, it was just another scheme. She played the role of caretaker, but her main interest was financial. She figured out that if she could house people living off Social Security, she could legally take a cut of their checks for room and board. To outsiders, it looked admirable. Social workers visited the home and were greeted with coffee pie and warm smiles. Dorothea even hosted dinners to impress them, cultivating the image of a woman with a heart of gold. Many social workers believed she was a gift to the community, a stable maternal figure for people who had no one else. But behind closed doors, things weren't nearly as kind. Dorothea had little patience for her tenants, especially the ones who struggled with alcohol. Maybe it reminded her too much of her parents. Maybe she just liked control. Either way, her Samaritan's house was less about compassion and more about exploitation. This was the beginning of a disturbing double life. By day, she was the caring matron, a savior to the downtrodden. By night, or behind the closed doors of her home, she was cold, calculating, and increasingly cruel. And little by little, she was learning just how far she could push her lies, her charm, and her ability to control people. It wouldn't be long before fraud and manipulation wouldn't be enough. The line between theft and something much darker was already starting to blur. Chapter 5. The Sweet Christian Grandmother. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Dorothea had already cycled through multiple marriages, identities, and schemes. Each one ended the same way: failure, abandonment, and another name change to cover the mess. You'd think after so many starts and stops she might slow down or find a way to live quietly. But Dorothea wasn't built for quiet. She was built for reinvention. Her third marriage didn't last, neither did her fourth. These unions were short, sometimes lasting only weeks, sometimes a little more than a year. One husband complained about her obsession with buying new pantyhose every single day, which sounds petty, but really it shows how shallow and fragile these relationships were. None of them had real substance, because Dorothea wasn't looking for love. She was looking for leverage, new names, new opportunities, new ways to hide. Financially, she was spiraling. Her first attempt at running a care home ended in bankruptcy, leaving her more than $10,000 in debt. But instead of walking away from the idea, she took notes. She studied her failures and decided she could try again, this time with a different image. So Dorothea shed her old skin once more. Gone was the brassy makeup, the dyed hair, the flashy clothes. In her place appeared a modest, silver-haired woman, dressed in conservative outfits, someone who looked more like a church-going grandmother than a schemer with a criminal record. She started telling people she was a devout Christian woman, dedicated to serving her community. And people believed her because she looked the part. By the time she rented a Victorian-style house at 2100 F Street in Sacramento, her transformation was complete. She lived in part of the house and filled the rest with boarders, elderly people, recovering alcoholics, men and women with mental health struggles. She opened her home to those most vulnerable, and from the outside it looked like an act of kindness. Social workers visited and were charmed. Dorothea always offered coffee and pie. She hosted dinners for her tenants and their caseworkers, creating an image of warmth and generosity. Many social workers truly believed she was one of the best resources available, a reliable placement for clients who had nowhere else to go. They called her a blessing. But behind the curtains, it was a different story. Dorothea ran a tight ship, sometimes cruelly so. She placed tenants who received larger government checks on the main floor, while those who had less to offer were crammed into makeshift rooms in the basement, separated only by curtains. She scolded and berated them, especially the alcoholics, lashing out with the kind of anger that likely came from her own painful memories of her parents. And despite her new grandmotherly persona, Dorothea herself was drinking heavily. The angelic facade was cracking, even as she convinced the outside world that she was a saint. Looking at this chapter of her life, I find it chilling, because it shows how easily appearances can deceive us. Dorothea had turned herself into the perfect cover story, a sweet older woman, a Christian caretaker, a helper of the helpless. But underneath the seeds of cruelty and exploitation were still growing, and soon those seeds would bloom into something far more sinister. Chapter 6. The First Signs of Something Darker. By the late 1970s, Dorothea had her act down perfectly. To the outside world, she was the sweet old woman who gave lost souls a place to stay. To the people living under her roof, she was strict, sometimes cruel, but still dependable in a way. It was a strange balance. She was harsh, but she provided a roof, meals, and structure, something many of her tenants had never had before. But fraud and control weren't enough anymore. Dorothea began to push her schemes further, moving from financial exploitation to something that looked a lot more like predatory behavior. One of her earliest known victims was a man named Malcolm. Dorothea met him at a bar, and on the surface it looked like an ordinary night. They drank, they talked, they flirted. Malcolm thought he was bringing home a kind older woman, but by the time they got back to his place, something felt wrong. His body stopped responding. He could still hear, still see, but he couldn't move. Imagine the terror of lying there trapped inside your own body, watching as this woman you trusted goes through your belongings. That's exactly what happened. Malcolm lay paralyzed, helpless, while Dorothea calmly collected anything of value, cash, jewelry, even a suitcase to pack it all up. Then she walked out, leaving him drugged and motionless. When the effects wore off, Malcolm called the police. And here's the most unbelievable part, he actually gave them her real name. He had no doubt who robbed him. But when Dorothea was caught trying to cash one of Malcolm's stolen checks, she brushed it off with excuses. She claimed he had given her the checks because he wanted to go steady. When that sounded too far-fetched, she pivoted to another excuse, some vague psychiatric condition that caused her memory to lapse. And unbelievably, the police let her go with just a warning to keep an eye on her. Not long after, another victim appeared. Irene, an elderly woman Dorothea met at a beauty salon. Irene wasn't feeling well and mentioned she was looking for a doctor. Dorothea slipped right into character, claiming she was a nurse who worked for Irene's doctor. That tiny lie was enough. Irene trusted her, invited her over for a house call, and sat down for what she thought was medical care. Dorothea showed up with a doctor's bag, checked Irene's blood pressure, and handed her pills, claiming they would help with water retention. Irene swallowed them, lay down to rest, and woke up hours later, missing her jewelry, her medications, and her sense of safety. All she remembered was that her nurse introduced herself as Betty. The stories lined up: drugged victims, stolen valuables, false identities. The pattern was clear. But again, Dorothea escaped consequences. Police couldn't connect her directly to the crimes, and her victims' testimonies weren't enough for charges to stick. She walked away free to keep scheming. And that's when something inside her shifted. Petty theft wasn't exciting anymore. Fraud was starting to feel small. If people could be drugged into helplessness so easily, if their lives could be controlled with just a few pills, what was stopping her from going further? Looking back, this is the moment when Dorothea began crossing an invisible line. She had tested the waters with robbery and deceit. Now she was ready to see what it would feel like to take things further toward the kind of darkness that can never be undone. Chapter 7. The Death of Ruth Monroe. By the early 1980s, Dorothea Puente had already left behind a trail of frightened victims and suspicious neighbors. She had stolen from men like Malcolm, lied her way into Irene's home, and walked out of every police interview without real punishment. Each time she got away with it, she seemed to grow bolder. And then came Ruth Monroe. Ruth wasn't a stranger she picked up in a bar or an elderly woman she met at the beauty salon. Ruth was a friend. That's what makes her death feel so different. Dorothea met Ruth through Ruth's husband, who was terminally ill. The two women hit it off, and before long, Dorothea convinced Ruth to move in with her at 1426 F Street. Dorothea dangled the promise of a business partnership talk, of catering shared investments, and a joint bank account. For Ruth, who was facing the heartbreak of a failing marriage and the stress of her husband's illness, it must have felt like a new beginning. But almost as soon as Ruth moved in, things started to unravel. She became sick suddenly, mysteriously, and alarmingly so. She confided to her children that she felt confused, weak, and strangely detached, as if her body wasn't her own. She even told one of her daughters that she thought she was dying. Her son Bill noticed something else strange. Ruth was drinking alcohol, specifically crème de menthe, a green liqueur she had never been known to touch. Day after day, he found her sipping it in Dorothea's house. It didn't make sense. Why would a woman who barely drank suddenly develop a taste for something so unusual? On the morning of April 1982, Ruth's daughter Rosie came to visit and found her mother deeply unconscious, impossible to wake. Dorothea reassured her that everything was fine, that local doctors had given Ruth something to calm her down. Rosie wanted to believe her. After all, Dorothea was older, respectable, and claimed to be a nurse. That same evening, Bill stopped by and found his mother lying stiffly on her side, her eyes open but unresponsive. He tried speaking to her, telling her not to worry, that Dorothea would take care of her. And as he spoke, he saw a single tear roll down her cheek. It was the kind of moment that sticks with you forever, your mother silenced by drugs, trapped inside her own body, shedding one last tear as her children placed their trust in the very woman who was poisoning her. The next morning, Dorothea called Ruth's daughter to say something was wrong. By the time paramedics arrived, Ruth was dead. Dorothea was quick to offer an explanation. Ruth had been under too much stress, her marriage was failing, and she must have committed suicide. She told investigators that Ruth's heart had simply given out under the weight of her troubles, but the autopsy raised questions. Ruth's liver showed signs of toxicity. She hadn't eaten in days. Her body was filled with alcohol. And when toxicology tests came back, the truth emerged. Ruth had died from an overdose of Tylenol and codeine. Her death was ruled inconclusive, but her family never believed it was natural. They suspected Dorothea from the very beginning. Still, there wasn't enough evidence to build a case. Dorothea walked away yet again, and almost immediately she drained the joint bank account she shared with Ruth. Instead of fleeing, she stayed right where she was, sharpening her methods and learning how to kill without leaving a trace. For me, this is the turning point in Dorothea's story. Up until now, she had been a liar, a thief, a manipulator. But Ruth's death signaled something darker. It was no longer about stealing jewelry or cashing stolen checks. It was about power control and eventually murder for profit. And Dorothea Puente, the sweet grandmotherly caretaker, had just claimed her first life. Chapter 8. The Man in the Red Truck. After Ruth Monroe's death, Dorothea should have had enough money to disappear. She had drained their joint bank account and could have fled anywhere, but that wasn't Dorothea's way. She stayed in Sacramento right there on F Street as if nothing had happened. Maybe it was arrogance, or maybe she thought she had perfected her methods. Either way, she was far from done. By the mid-1980s, Dorothea had begun writing letters to a man named Everson Gilmouth, a 70-year-old widower from Oregon. Somehow, even from prison during one of her shorter stints, Dorothea managed to strike up a correspondence with him. And when she was released, their letters turned into something more. They made plans to live together. Everson left Oregon, leaving behind worried relatives, and moved into Dorothea's boarding house on F Street. To his sister, who had never met Dorothea, the whole thing seemed rushed and suspicious. She worried her brother was being taken advantage of, but what could she do? Everson was a grown man. He insisted he was happy. And when police performed a wellness check after she raised concerns, Everson himself angrily told them to stay out of his life. But soon after, the letters Everson's sister received in the mail didn't sound like her brother at all. They were written in Dorothea's hand, signed in his name, insisting everything was fine. It was clear he wasn't the one writing them. Meanwhile, Dorothea still had a carpenter friend doing odd jobs around her house. One day, she offered him a deal. If he helped her with some work, she would pay him with a red pickup truck. What the carpenter didn't know was that the truck had belonged to Everson. Dorothea then asked him for something else, a wooden box. 6 feet long, 3 feet wide. She told him it was for storing old things. He built the box, delivered it, and thought nothing more of it. But when he returned a few days later, the box had been nailed shut, and was so heavy it took real effort to move. Dorothea asked him to help load it into the pickup truck. Together they drove it to a secluded riverbank. She told him to dump it there, and he did. Months later, in January 1986, that same box was discovered. 2 men stumbled upon it, noticed a foul smell, and opened it. Inside was a badly decomposed body, wrapped in garbage bags, mothballs, and even deodorant sticks, as if someone had tried to mask the odor. At first, the body was listed as a John Doe. It would take 3 years before investigators finally identified it as Everson Gilmouth. And while his body lay in that box, mice identified and forgotten, Dorothea kept cashing his Social Security checks. She lived in his house, drove his truck until she got rid of it, and went about her life as though Everson had never existed. This chapter of her story is one of the most chilling to me, not just because of the body in the makeshift coffin, but because it showed how easily Dorothea erased people. To her, they weren't human beings, with families, histories, and futures. They were resources, sources of income she could manipulate, use, and then discard. And the most disturbing part? No one was connecting the dots. Everson's disappearance was written off, Ruth's death was inconclusive, and Dorothea kept on smiling, hosting dinners, baking pies, and charming social workers into believing she was a saint. Behind that grandmotherly facade, though the groundwork for mass murder was already being laid. Chapter 9. The Boarding House of No Return. After Everson Gilmouth vanished into that makeshift coffin, Dorothea Puente seemed untouchable. She had pulled off what should have been an obvious murder, yet no one came knocking on her door. No investigators, no arrests. Life at 1426 F Street carried on as if nothing had happened, and with every close call she survived, Dorothea only grew bolder. Her Victorian home on F Street began to take on a new kind of reputation. To social workers, she was still the reliable placement, someone who could take in the people nobody else wanted. Alcoholics, addicts, the homeless, the mentally ill, they all found their way to Dorothea's door. And to the outside world, she looked like a savior. She cooked meals, hosted Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, even baked pies for inspectors who came by. She was warm, attentive, grandmotherly. She knew exactly how to put people at ease. But behind closed doors, the atmosphere was very different. Tenants lived under strict rules. Meals were served at rigid times: breakfast at 6:30, dinner at 3:30 sharp. Miss one and you didn't eat. The kitchen was off limits, the mail was intercepted, and the phone was forbidden. Dorothea controlled every dollar, every letter, every outside contact, and she had a system. Tenants who received bigger Social Security checks got better rooms upstairs or on the main floor. Those with less to offer were shoved into the basement behind thin curtains masquerading as walls. To Dorothea, they weren't people. They were paychecks. She even had a trick for getting rid of difficult tenants. When someone drank too much, she would encourage it, then call the police to report them as disorderly. They'd be locked up for a few weeks, sometimes a month, and in that time, Dorothea would quietly pocket their benefits. And when they came back weak and broke, she welcomed them as if nothing had happened. From the outside, it looked like order. Inside, it was control, exploitation, and growing cruelty. Dorothea herself was drinking heavily, lashing out at tenants, and showing glimpses of the rage that had been building since her childhood. She knew exactly how to manipulate the people in her care, men and women who had nowhere else to go and no one to advocate for them. What strikes me here is how invisible it all was. Neighbors sometimes complained about a stench coming from the backyard, but nothing was ever done. Social workers continued to trust her, believing she was doing the work no one else wanted. And the tenants, stripped of their independence, were too vulnerable or too frightened to speak out. This was the perfect hunting ground for someone like Dorothea. Every new resident was a potential victim, every Social Security check a prize, and she had already shown with Ruth and Everson that she knew how to make people disappear without raising alarms. The house on F Street wasn't just a boarding house anymore. It was becoming something far darker, a place where the forgotten were taken in, and where many of them would never be seen alive again. Chapter 10. The Disappearance of Bert Montoya. By the late 1980s, Dorothea's boarding house was running like a well-oiled machine. She had dozens of tenants over the years, and the money kept flowing in. But one particular tenant would change everything for her, a man named Bert Montoya. Bert wasn't just another drifter. He was a man with schizophrenia who had been living on the streets. For years, he'd struggled to keep steady housing and care, until finally an outreach counselor took him under her wing. She helped him apply for benefits, get his medication, and start piecing his life back together. And when it came time to find him a stable place to live, there was one name that came up again and again: Dorothea Puente. To the counselor, Dorothea looked perfect. She was motherly, reliable, and well-known in the community. So she placed Bert in Dorothea's care, believing he would be safe there. At first, it looked like the right choice. Bert was clean-dressed, taking his medication, and attending meals. He was stable in a way he hadn't been for years. But Dorothea had other plans. In March of 1988, she marched Bert down to the Social Security office. She told the staff that Bert was developmentally disabled and couldn't handle his own finances. She even claimed to be his cousin, making herself the official payee for his monthly checks. And the office, trusting her reputation, agreed. From that point forward, all of Bert's benefits went directly to Dorothea. Not long after Bert disappeared, just like that. When tenants asked what happened, Dorothea had an answer ready. She told them Bert had gone to Mexico to live with family. It was neat, simple, and believable enough that most people didn't push back. Except for one problem: Bert didn't speak Spanish. The counselor, who had worked so closely with him, didn't buy it for a second. She knew Bert wasn't the type to just vanish, especially not without telling her. So she filed a missing persons report and insisted that police look into it. When officers visited 1426 F Street, they started asking around. Tenants repeated Dorothea's story about Bert leaving for Mexico, but one man slipped an officer a note in secret. It read, "She's making me lie for her." That note was the crack in Dorothea's facade. For the first time, police had more than just suspicions. They had a reason to dig deeper. And dig they did. Literally. Neighbors had been complaining for months about a horrible smell coming from the yard, a stench Dorothea brushed off as bad soil or garbage. But with Bert missing and that note in hand, investigators were finally ready to see what was hiding beneath the ground at 1426 F Street. They came back with warrant shovels and a growing sense that the grandmotherly caretaker everyone trusted wasn't who she seemed to be. What they uncovered would shock not only the neighborhood, but the entire country. Chapter 11. Digging in the Garden of Secrets. When police arrived at 1426 F Street with a search warrant, it didn't look like the scene of a crime. From the outside, Dorothea's little Victorian bungalow seemed almost sweet, like the home of someone's kindly grandmother. But the neighbors' complaints of a foul odor combined with Bert Montoya's disappearance gave investigators reason to dig deeper. Literally. On that first day, detectives and forensic teams turned over soil in the yard. At first, what they found didn't make sense. Scraps of cloth, odd debris, and what looked like tree roots or old meat. But as they kept digging, one officer unearthed something that made his stomach drop a shoe with a human foot still inside. The illusion was shattered. Dorothea Puente's garden wasn't filled with roses and vegetables. It was filled with bodies. Over the next several days, investigators expanded their search. They broke into the concrete patio, pried open the earth beneath the gazebo, and dug along the side yard. One by one, the remains surfaced. First one body, then another. Soon the count climbed to 7. Each corpse showed signs of drugging high concentrations of sleeping pills mixed with alcohol or other depressants. These weren't natural deaths. They were orchestrated killings. And here's the part that still blows my mind. While investigators were out there in her yard, pulling up body after body, Dorothea herself walked right up to the lead detective and calmly asked if she was under arrest. When he told her no, she said she was going to grab a cup of coffee at a nearby hotel. They let her go. Hours passed. More bodies were found. And Dorothea. She vanished into the city. Think about that for a moment. A woman whose yard was literally being excavated for corpses strolled away from a crime scene pocketing cash and hopped from hotel to hotel until she could disappear into Los Angeles. It's almost surreal. Back at the house, the reality sank in. Investigators weren't just looking at the disappearance of Bert Montoya. They were standing in the middle of one of the most shocking serial murder cases in California's history. Each victim was vulnerable, forgotten by society. Men and women with addictions, mental illness, or no family to check on them. To Dorothea, they were the perfect targets. She drugged them, took their benefits, and when they no longer served her, she buried them like discarded trash in her own backyard. It was chilling, calculated, and all hidden beneath the mask of a kindly caretaker. As police continued to identify the bodies, a manhunt began. Dorothea Puente, the little old lady everyone thought was harmless, was suddenly one of the most wanted women in America. Chapter 12. The Fugitive Grandmother. While detectives kept unearthing bodies in the backyard of 1426 F Street, Dorothea Puente was already gone. With the calmness of someone running a quick errand, she told police she was heading out for coffee, and they let her walk away. By the time investigators realized the scale of what they had uncovered, Dorothea was miles from Sacramento, slipping into the anonymity of Los Angeles. She carried about $3,000 in cash, enough to keep her moving. First, she checked into a hotel and had a few stiff drinks, vodka and grapefruit juice, her favorite. Then she hopped cabs across the city, eventually boarding a bus to Los Angeles, as if she had rehearsed her escape route. Meanwhile, her face was everywhere. News anchors across the country showed her photo, describing her as a sweet-looking grandmother, wanted in connection with multiple bodies buried at her home. The story was almost too bizarre to believe a frail, gray-haired woman suspected of running a house of death. But Dorothea wasn't hiding in shadows. True to form, she went to a bar. That's where she met Charles, a middle-aged man, who thought he was just chatting with a lonely widow. Dorothea introduced herself as Donna, spinning her usual tale of heartache. Her husband had died. She was starting over. She just needed companionship. The two spent the day together, and Dorothea even suggested they move in with each other. But Charles couldn't shake a nagging thought she looked familiar. He stared at her face, replaying the conversation, and then it clicked. He had seen her photo on the news. The grandmother serial killer everyone was looking for was sitting right next to him. Charles played it cool, but as soon as he had the chance, he picked up the phone and called the police. That night, officers swarmed the hotel where Dorothea was staying. At 10:40 p.m., they arrested her without a fight. She didn't resist, didn't protest. In fact, on the flight back to Sacramento, she kept repeating the same line to detectives: "I never killed anyone. I just cashed their checks." It's almost eerie, isn't it? Even as the evidence stacked up, even as bodies were pulled from her garden, Dorothea clung to the idea that she was just a harmless woman who made a few bad choices with money. She leaned into her appearance, her age, her soft-spoken demeanor. But beneath that mask, investigators knew they were dealing with a calculated predator who had turned her boarding house into a trap for the forgotten. By the time she was brought back to Sacramento, the world no longer saw Dorothea Puente as a kind caretaker. She was now the House Landlady, the grandmother who buried her tenants in the yard, and she was about to stand trial for murder. Chapter 13. The Trial of the House Landlady. By the time Dorothea Puente was brought back to Sacramento, the entire country knew her name. The headlines painted her as a chilling contradiction, a grandmotherly figure with pearls and soft sweaters who had buried bodies in her backyard. The press called her the House Landlady, and soon it was time for her to face trial. Her case officially began in February of 1993, almost 4 years after her arrest. Prosecutors charged her with 9 counts of murder, 9 lives they argued cut short by a woman who exploited the vulnerable for profit. But even with all the bodies, the case wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. The challenge for the prosecution was evidence. There were no eyewitnesses who saw her commit a murder. The victims' bodies had been buried for months, even years, and decomposition had destroyed much of the physical proof. Yes, toxicology showed traces of powerful sedatives like flurazepam, but Dorothea's defense team was ready with an explanation. These were sick, elderly people who died of natural causes. The pills, they claimed, were just part of her care. In court, Dorothea leaned into her grandmotherly image. She wore conservative dresses, pearl necklaces, and glasses that made her look more like a librarian than a killer. When she testified, she kept her face calm, her voice steady, insisting she was innocent. She admitted to cashing her tenants' checks, yes, but murder never. Her defense argued that the only reason she hid bodies was because she feared losing her boarding house license. Reporting deaths would have drawn attention to her criminal record, and she didn't want to go back to prison. According to them, she was guilty of poor judgment, not homicide. But the prosecution countered with the scale of her crimes. They presented evidence that Dorothea had forged signatures on over 60 benefit checks belonging to dead tenants, bringing in thousands of dollars each month. They brought in handwriting experts, medical examiners, and even the carpenter who had unknowingly built the coffin-like box used to dispose of Everson Gilmouth's body. His testimony painted a haunting picture Dorothea had orchestrated every step. The trial dragged on for months, 5 in total. Over 150 witnesses testified, and more than 3,000 pieces of evidence were presented. At times, it felt like the jury was being buried under the weight of details, forced to sort fact from Dorothea's carefully constructed lies. In December of 1993, after weeks of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Dorothea Puente was found guilty of 3 murders: Dorothy Miller, Benjamin Fink, and Leona Carpenter. On the other 6 counts, the jury was deadlocked. It wasn't that they believed she was innocent. It was that the evidence had been too badly eroded by time to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Still, the outcome was enough. Dorothea was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 64 years old, she would spend the rest of her life behind bars. And yet, even in sentencing, Dorothea maintained her innocence. She told reporters, "I used to be a very good person," at one time. It was a strange, haunting statement, part denial, part confession, and maybe a glimpse into how she saw herself. The trial didn't answer every question. It didn't explain how one woman could move bodies into her yard without help, or why some victims had missing limbs. But it did something important. It ended the career of one of America's most deceptive serial killers. Dorothea Puente, the woman who fooled neighbors, social workers, and even the police, would never walk free again. Chapter 14. Life Behind Bars. When the courtroom doors finally closed and the verdict was handed down, Dorothea Puente's story should have ended. She had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 64 years old, there was no chance of her walking out free. And yet, even inside prison walls, Dorothea managed to hold on to the same unsettling duality that had defined her life part, ordinary grandmother part, calculated predator. She was sent to the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, the largest women's prison in the country. There, she settled into her new routine with the same quiet composure she'd once used to charm social workers and neighbors. Other inmates often described her as polite, reserved, even grandmotherly. It was as though the sweet old lady mask never came off. But prison didn't erase her hunger for control or her need to maintain an image. In 2005, more than a decade after her conviction, Dorothea somehow found her way back into the public eye with something unexpected: a cookbook. Yes, a cookbook written from her prison cell. It was called Cooking with a Serial Killer Recipes from Dorothea Puente. The book featured recipes she supposedly enjoyed making alongside stories and commentary from her life. The reviews, strangely enough, were positive. Readers were both horrified and fascinated. How could someone who buried tenants in her backyard also be sharing recipes for meatloaf and pies? That contradiction, the ordinary mixed with the monstrous, was exactly what made Dorothea so chilling. In interviews from behind bars, she rarely showed remorse. She never confessed to the murders. She brushed off the accusations, saying things like, "I don't give a damn what anyone thinks." To the end, she maintained that she had only ever been guilty of cashing checks, nothing more. And maybe that's what made her so terrifying. Dorothea Puente wasn't like other killers who boasted about their crimes or sought recognition. She lived in denial, cloaked in ordinariness, convincing herself and sometimes others that she was a good person who had simply made mistakes. Dorothea died in prison on March 27, 2011, at the age of 82. She had spent nearly 2 decades behind bars. Even in death, she left behind unanswered questions. Did she really act alone? How many more victims might there have been? And how could a woman who looked so harmless, so unremarkable, commit such unspeakable crimes? The house at 1426 F Street still stands. It has passed through different owners, some of whom have leaned into its grim history, putting up signs that joke about trespassers being drugged and buried in the yard. Neighbors still talk about it. Tourists still drive by, and the name Dorothea Puente lingers in Sacramento's memory like a shadow that never quite goes away. In the end, her story isn't just about murder. It's about deception, about how appearances can hide darkness, and how easy it is to overlook the vulnerable when they vanish quietly. Dorothea built her life on that invisibility. She chose victims no one else was watching, and for years it worked, until the garden gave up its secrets. So what do you think about the case of Dorothea Puente? To me, it's one of the most haunting examples of how manipulation and deception can hide in plain sight. Dorothea built her life on trust. Neighbors trusted her, social workers trusted her, even her victims trusted her. And that's what made her so effective and so terrifying. Her story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How well do we really know the people around us? How many red flags do we ignore because someone seems harmless, or because it's easier to believe the best in them? Dorothea exploited that kindness, and she turned it into a weapon. Thank you for spending your time with me today as we revisited this case. If you want more true crime stories told in depth, don't forget to subscribe to True Crime Echoes. Until next time, stay safe, take care of each other, and always remember, sometimes the most ordinary faces can hide the darkest secrets.